Considering how long a sequel to the iconic 1988 movie Beetlejuice was in the works only to be constantly shut down, the fact that one finally got made is something of a miracle. The bigger miracle, however, is that it actually managed to be pretty good despite everything it had stacked against it. Now I know there are some who were disappointed with it or felt that it should have been completely different, and it's most definitely their prerogative to feel that way, but when looked at from an objective standpoint, what they were able to achieve with this movie is actually pretty impressive. And today, while staying completely fair and neutral, I would like to take a look at Beetlejuice Beetlejuice and hopefully explain everything that it gets right in being a sequel to the original. And there will be spoilers ahead, so in case you've been meaning to check this movie out and don't want anything ruined, you should definitely click off the video. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Alright, so one of the first things that must be mentioned here is that since this movie came out over 35 years after the original, it would basically be a given that most of the returning cast would be sidelined with the possible exception of Michael Keaton to make way for a younger generation. And the trailers didn't really do much to quell this notion, since a lot of emphasis is placed on Lydia's daughter, Astrid, played by an up-and-coming and very popular Jenna Ortega. But instead of doing that, the movie is actually very much Lydia's story. And that's honestly exactly what it should have been. Because if you look at the original Beetlejuice movie, apart from the Maitlands, it's basically more her movie than anybody else's. So it only stands to reason that the sequel should be a continuation of her story. Many fans of the original even said that apart from the titular character, Lydia was the only other person whose appearance was an absolute must in a hypothetical sequel, and thus they did the smart thing and not sideline her to make way for something more marketable. And even if she's not in a good place at the start, her developing extreme problems in later life due to being able to see ghosts was honestly not a bad approach to that story either. And on that topic, another smart thing they did was writing the Maitlands out and having them not make an appearance. Now, as I noted before, there are those who feel that a sequel shouldn't have been made without them, as they're essentially what makes the first movie. And again, if you personally believe that, that's totally fine. But Tim Burton said he didn't want the Maitlands to appear because ghosts aren't supposed to age, and he didn't think that the de-aging technology would be convincing enough to make Gina Davis and Alec Baldwin look the way they did in 1988. And again, that was probably the right way to go about it. Because sure, he may have been wrong, but at the same time, why risk it? If it didn't look good, which it almost certainly wouldn't have, it would have taken away from and cheapened what should be an extremely emotional and heartfelt moment. So they were better off not doing it at all and just implying that once you move on to the afterlife, you don't come back. And not to mention, the most stable parental figures in her life leaving her helps go a long way in explaining why Lydia is in such a bad place at the beginning. Again, the Maitlands being front and center would have probably made for a more suitable sequel, but considering what they had to work with, they definitely made the right call in writing them out altogether. But then there's also the issue of how they handled Charles' death, because simply put, bringing back his original actor was out of the question. But at the same time, just killing him off doesn't mean much in a movie that focuses on the afterlife, so at first glance it looked like the writers were stuck between a rock and a hard place, because Charles may be a bit neglectful, but it's clear he loves Lydia and would never leave her. But at the same time, if he's killed off, how do you explain his absence in the afterlife? And the movie gets around this problem by having him be decapitated by a shark. And since it's established in the first movie that the ghosts take on whatever form they were in at the time of their death, allows them to be in the movie played by a different actor because he doesn't have a head anymore. And if I could just inject my personal opinion for a second, that was honestly a genius way to get around the problem. Because simply saying he died and not showing him in the afterlife would have been a complete complete cop-out. But by having him die the way he does, it avoided the issue of his casting while also allowing the character to still be present in the movie. But even aside from how it handles individual characters, there's also the fact that it's surprisingly cultured and sophisticated in nature, which is something one would not expect from a film like this. Seriously, the level of depth that's given to classic literature and icons is pretty surprising, especially because you don't see that too often in movies these days. Even Beetlejuice's monologue on his backstory is modeled after the works of Italian horror director Mario Bava, which is why the sequence is in both black and white and spoken in Italian as an homage to him, and is even name-dropped later on. Though this isn't really too surprising, considering Bava was one of Tim Burton's biggest influences. And honestly, it was probably Burton's returning to direct the sequel, along with the returning cast, that makes the movie a lot better than most other legacy sequels, because he lends the production a more old-school quality that's missing from most films these days, hence the many references to culture, literary works, and homages to directors of old, as well as using way more practical effects, which in turn makes the movie a lot better visually, because such things as Bob, and all the other shrinkheads for that matter, are completely practical with no CGI added. The sandworm is once again animated with stop motion, even though the model weighed 13 pounds, and Dolores' transformation is almost entirely comprised of in-camera tricks, with the only digital effects being the more elaborate moments where her body parts are shown to be separated. Even the close-up where she staples her face together is a completely practical effect. The point here is, almost any other director, especially of the younger generation, would have relied on computers for all the effects in the film, and considering how that usually turns out, the results probably wouldn't have been too good. But because Burton comes from an older generation, and in turn has an appreciation for an even older generation, and has always had a style all his own, he lends the movie a very artistic and unique quality that's solely missing from most films nowadays. He even said that this movie helped him regain his love of filmmaking and was a very personal film, and it shows, because it's very obvious he was having a blast making this. But at the same time, not all the credit belongs to Burton in regards to making Beetlejuice Beetlejuice better than most sequels of its kind, as the returning cast most definitely knows what they're doing and absolutely bring their A game to portraying their characters again. But especially Michael Keaton, who you can tell has been waiting a long time to cut loose again and is absolutely relishing in every second of it. But what also helps is that all the new additions were perfectly cast as well, from Justin Theroux's manipulative, toxic leech to Willem Dafoe's over-the-top afterlife cop in way over his head. But special mention must go to Jenna Ortega, because even the biggest haters of this movie have got to admit that nobody could have been better suited to play the daughter of Lydia Dietz. Seriously, Ortega fits her role like a glove. There was no stunt casting when it came to that. Now, all that being said, and to be perfectly fair here, one of the movie's biggest criticisms is usually that it's too cluttered and overstuffed. And this is most definitely true, as the film seems to have more plot lines running through it than a long-form TV show. But that being said, it's amazing how well the movie manages to juggle most of them. Obviously the results are by no means perfect, but I've written books. I know what it's like to deal with a story that has way too much going on, and how it inevitably becomes impossible to find a resolution for everything you introduce in a meaningful way. But somehow, this movie manages to more or less do it, because pretty much everything it introduces, it manages to find a satisfactory ending to, with none of it really feeling like anything was overlooked or rushed because of it. And I'm just going to come out and say it. I have never seen a movie be able to introduce so many different story beats and be able to handle all of them so effectively. Pretty much the only plot point that feels underdeveloped and kind of wasted is Dolores, Beetlejuice's literal soul-sucking ex-wife. because she's initially built up as this huge threat that's going to become a massive problem, but in the end she doesn't do much and Beetlejuice is able to take her out easily. But again, that's pretty much the only plot thread the movie introduces that it's not really able to do anything meaningful with, which is still a shame, seeing as she makes for a great villain, but there is always the third movie where she could make a return. Even Wolf Jackson, who at first could seem like a useless addition, actually does his job perfectly of establishing that the afterlife still has some kind of police force and authority, while also serving as something of a joke character because he's only an actor and thus isn't actually qualified for the assignments he's given, hence why he constantly fails to accomplish anything important. So while Beetlejuice Beetlejuice is by no means a perfect film, it's still a much better sequel to the original than it had any right to, and that mainly comes down to the return of Tim Burton, the original cast, and the screenwriter's somewhat miraculous ability to finish almost everything they start. Again, as a writer myself, the way they were able to juggle so many plot lines and have time for almost all of them is really impressive. Sure, it may not have been the ideal sequel, and does have its fair share of issues, but when compared to most other films from decades past that get a sequel in the modern era, this one blows pretty much all of them right out of the water. Now that's not exactly high praise, considering how bad most of those sequels turn out to be, but at least it's something. In the end, Beetlejuice Beetlejuice is a worthy attempt at a sequel to the iconic and weird original, and considering how much worse it could have been, that is saying quite a lot. Okay, that's everything I wanted to say on that. So now let me know what you think. Do you believe that the long-awaited Beetlejuice sequel was a flawed but nonetheless satisfying attempt to bring the famed demon back to the big screen? Or do you think the sequel for the most part failed and that it could have been done way better? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because as I emphasized repeatedly throughout the video, you do not have to agree with anything I said here, and if you think I had this whole topic completely wrong, that is absolutely okay. You can feel about both Beetlejuice and its sequel however you wish, and nobody can tell you you're wrong for feeling that way. And thank you all for watching. I appreciate it very much. And I hope to see you all next time.